So I hate to date myself, but I'm a child of the 80s. I don't know how many of you were as well. My favorite movie by far was Back to the Future. Favorite TV show were shows like Knight Rider, because they gave you this glimpse of what the future was going to look like. Right? Do you remember, especially as it relates to transportation, what we were promised? We were promised flying cars, which actually now do exist. There are 7 companies that are now in production or getting close to launch of basically vertical takeoff and landing vehicles based on drone technology. So that was pretty good. We were also promised vehicles that could drive themselves. I don't know how you remember, but KITT, Knight Rider, could drive itself. That now exists as well. We were promised hoverboards, my favorite. Of course, we don't have really hoverboards today, but we do have one-wheelers zipping around our streets. We have electric scooters zipping around our streets. We have electric bikes and things like that. So folks like Steven Spielberg, Robert Zemeckis, and others did a pretty good job at predicting what the future was going to look like. About 10 years ago, the late Tom Alberg and myself and a few others started talking about the ACES. The ACES was this name that we gave to these 4 megatrends that were transforming transportation. These included autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, electric vehicles, and shared vehicles. These 4 megatrends that were changing transportation. The interesting thing, though, it wasn't about each of these trends independently. It was about the integration of these trends. If you could have autonomous robot taxis that could pick people up, drop them off, they could be connected so they could be efficiently routed, they would be electric so that they would be very less pollution, and they'd be shared so you could have fewer of them on the road than if each person owned their own vehicle. So that was the vision for the ACES and where we saw it going into the future. The question, though, is what happened to the ACES? We started talking about this 10 years ago. There's been a lot of good press, bad press, COVID, things like that. So I was asked to spend maybe 20 minutes giving you an update on what was happening with transportation. And as you would imagine, a lot of this has been transformed through artificial intelligence. Now, many of you are familiar with the S-curve, right? Technologies that are brought into the market typically follow what's called an S-curve. What that means is they start out slow. As people do development, they do initial testing, there's some early adopters, but it's only after iterations of it. I don't know how many of you used Windows 1.0, maybe Bob Metcalf here did, but very few others used Windows 1.0. It was only until version 3 when it started to get mass adoption and climb up that S-curve to market expansion and then eventually to maturation, saturation, and then ultimately decline is what you see over time. So this S-curve is a very interesting model in technology for how technologies kind of progress. And what I want to do is I want to talk about each of the different ACES because they're at different stages on this S-curve along the way. And the interesting thing, though, is, again, the interest is the integration of how all these play together, which we'll talk about near the end. Now, there's been a lot of good news. Let's start with autonomous vehicles. There's been a lot of good news as it relates to AVs. Many of you know Waymo now is in production and live in 3 cities, San Francisco, LA, and Phoenix. In these cities, you can today use your mobile app. You can summon an autonomous vehicle, it can pick you up, and it'll drop you off where you need to go. Waymo has already announced the next cities are going to be Austin and it's going to be San Francisco. So you're going to see these things, Austin and LA. You'll see these expand over the course of 2025 and beyond. Google has already driven more than 10 million miles of road. The interesting thing for me is this phenomenon that you now see in Phoenix, where parents, when they need to take their kids somewhere and they don't want to drive them, they're much more comfortable putting them in an AV than in an Uber or Lyft. The biggest fear in the transportation space was that people were going to be afraid to get in AVs. But this is a case where the parents are more comfortable putting their kid into an AV than putting it into a car with a stranger. Interestingly enough, if you actually look at the market surveys, women are very similar. Women are a little skeptical about getting into an Uber or Lyft with a strange driver. A lot of cases, they feel safer. The majority polled in Phoenix who use these AVs feel safer getting into a car with no one at all rather than a human driver. So fascinating to see how this market perception has changed just over the last few years. Next up is Tesla. Many of you are aware that the last couple weeks, Tesla made a series of announcements around what they call cyber cab. Instead of robotaxi, cyber cab. And in 2027, they're going to bring to market a cyber cab at a $30,000 price point. That makes it very accessible to bring these into the market. Probably more interesting, though, is next year, 2025, anybody with an existing Model 3 or Y is going to get an update that does full self-driving. What does this mean? It means you can get in your car in the morning, you can say, take me to work, sit back, read a newspaper. No longer hands on the steering wheel. That happens next year, and the most fascinating thing is these are not new vehicles. These are existing 3 and Y vehicles that are already on the road will be given this capability. So a lot of good news in the AV space. The bad news that many people are aware of is GM's autonomous vehicle unit called Cruise actually had an accident a couple years ago. It hit somebody, drove over them, and then dragged them, and the vehicle did not realize that it was dragging that individual. So GM paused their AV program, and this has had sort of a very big chilling effect on the overall industry. Now, the interesting thing is this. One hit, one person killed, caused them to pause the whole thing. Do you know how many vehicles GM ships in a given year and how many vehicles GM vehicles are involved in that are gas-powered? GM has about a 7 to 8% market share globally. That means about 80 to 90,000 accidents globally each year are caused by GM vehicles that are gas-powered. So people are very sensitive, obviously, about the AVs, maybe justifiably so. But we do have to keep things a little bit in perspective. So what's been driving the AV trend has certainly been the growth of AI. It's certainly been things like a lot of innovation, a lot of investment going into this for the simple reason that people want that future. They want that future that we were promised in Back to the Future, where I can get in a car and it'll just take me from point A to point B without the stress that I need in my life. So what's inhibiting the AVs? I would say 3 things. The first, without question, is the speed of technological development. This is a classic 80-20. 80% of the development project is relatively straightforward. It's that last 20% that's the hard thing. In the case of AVs, it has everything to do with the roads and the weather. There is a reason that Waymom launched in Phoenix, LA, Austin, San Francisco. These are warm markets. They don't get snow. They're very well marked. They're very well maintained roads. Next year, Waymom was promised to launch into Buffalo and New York, which of course are much more difficult markets. What happens when you have snow? What happens when that vehicle is driving on gravel? What happens if there's a flood? What happens if there's a hurricane? What happens if you're in Asheville, North Carolina, and all of a sudden the roads are gone? What does an AV do? It's that last 20% that's the problem. So what we see is the speed of technological development. Easy use cases first, and then over time, we'll deal with more and more use cases as these things get better and better. Second is testing and regulatory approval. How do you approve a vehicle that doesn't have a driver for the road? Think about the problem for NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. How do you certify that? What are the criteria? How many people can it hit a given year? And that's okay. Very, very tough problems. And unlike, say, ChatGPT, where if you type in a prompt and it gives you a wrong answer, and you say, oh, well, if a vehicle gets it wrong, somebody could get killed. So the bar is certainly much higher, but it has yet to be determined at the federal level how high that bar actually is. And then finally, certainly public policies are having a very big impact on AVs. Where can they drive? When can they drive? A lot of cities are trying to restrict them. Some cities are trying to promote them. But this has a very big impact on the deployment of overall AVs in our market areas. So let's talk about the second trend, which is electric vehicles. Now, this is further up the S-curve. If you look at overall electric vehicles, last quarter in the United States, 10% of cars that shipped were electrified. In Europe, 20% of those vehicles were electrified. Fast forward to the end of this decade, most analysts put this number at well over 50% in terms of vehicles that are electrified. So what's driving that trend? Simple. I'd say three things. Number one, it makes people feel good. They're driving an electric, they're doing something for the environment, less pollution, it's a lot better. Now, most people, of course, don't know whether their power is coming from a nuclear power plant that's clean, or hydro, or wind, or solar, or whether it's coming from coal or fossil fuels. But that's beside the point. For most people, electric made them feel good, and it's a good statement. The second reason, of course, is it's kind of a new thing. It's technologically cool. People like it. They're on the early edge, things like that. But what's also driving this trend, of course, is government incentives have been a very big factor. When we started with electric vehicles, there was, at least in this state, federally, $5,000, $7,000, $10,000, some states, $15,000 incentives to go off and buy an electric vehicle. You still see those kind of incentives playing a role, although many states have started to roll those back. So really the question is, what happens in the near future in terms of electric vehicles? We also have the problem, of course, of charging infrastructure. Many people still deal with range anxiety. The average EV has over 300 miles now in terms of its overall range. Most people don't drive anywhere near 300 miles on a given day. The average is about 20, 22 miles for the average commuter. So shouldn't be a problem, but of course, if you're only going to own one car, you want a car that can go take you to your vacation spot. You want a car that can take you to grandma's house, which may be 2 hours away or something like that. And you don't want to worry about this range anxiety. So helping people deal with range anxiety through more charge stations is obviously a very big deal. So there's been a lot of investment in it. The challenge has been, of course, it's very, very expensive to put in manual infrastructure. It's very expensive to run power that you need to these locations. And the dirty little secret about charge stations is about 22 to 25% at any given time aren't working, or they're not working at the speed that they're rated for. So this is an issue for people, and this is one of the barriers that we have. The other has been battery technology. Over the last 2 years, there's been a 30% reduction in the overall cost of lithium batteries for EVs. Over the next 2 years, it's projected that will continue, so another 30% decrease. Many of you know that this is the number one cost of producing an EV is the battery itself. So by reducing the cost of the overall battery, it reduces the overall price of the vehicle, makes that price per performance equation completely different. And this is why folks like Elon Musk can say, I'm going to produce a $30,000 EV in the near future. The other issue, of course, are what are governments doing in terms of promoting EVs? You can argue the incentives are good, you can argue they're bad. Obviously, you have a bunch of economists, they'll give you a bunch of different answers. But at the end of the day, that's a very big factor. California mandated that by 2035, every vehicle sold in California was going to be electric. Washington State, Oregon, very similar things. You've got about a dozen other states that are looking to follow suit. So the question is, do they continue those mandates or do they start to pull them back? That'll have a very big impact. And the same thing with automakers. GM, Ford Motor Company, Volkswagen Group, BMW, they all announced over the last 3 years 100% of their fleets were going to be electric. All four of those have pulled back over the last year, saying, no, we're not so sure. So uncertain what the future is, but no question that in terms of market share, EVs have grown and continued to grow. What about connected vehicles? Now here's the interesting question. How many of you have a connected vehicle? I love this. Look at the hands. Okay? 75% of the vehicles shipped last year were connected. Every time I ask this question at a conference, I get the same thing. A couple of hands go up. Because now if I go around and I ask, what vehicle do you have? Bob, what year is your vehicle? Guess what? The vast majority of people do not know that their car is connected. When I say connected, what I'm referring to is a vehicle that has an embedded cellular phone in it that's transmitting data to the automaker. This is used to report things like engine performance to basically the maker of the vehicle. It's used to do things like crash detection. If you crash, your airbags go off, it basically automatically notifies the police and the ambulance. It does things like deliver traffic data or parking data to your dashboard. So 75% of vehicles last year were connected. That number is going to go to over 90%, 95% probably by the end of this decade. Now, why is that? Turns out it's great for the car makers. It's great for the car makers because guess what? One of the biggest costs they have is warranty claims. Is there something wrong with your car? Well, guess what? Previously, I had to go recall 3 million vehicles. Do you know what it's like to go recall 3 million vehicles and then go pay for that? Now I can basically look at the vehicle data, I can look at the vehicle computers and just recall those 30,000 that actually have the problem rather than recalling 3 million that might have a problem. So car makers love putting in these connected devices for a broad variety of reasons, and consumers love them too, obviously because it gives you very useful information. You now have alerts on the dashboard in many vehicles, Audis, BMWs, Porsches, etc., that are basically telling you that there's ice on the road ahead, that there's road closures, things like that, that help you obviously be safer and much more effective as a driver. The interesting thing for me, though, is this. If you look at the press, it's been very positive. A lot of people, like you said, a lot of people enjoy the fact that they're getting these real-time alerts in their vehicles. We now have real alerts that go to drivers when, for instance, there's a protest up ahead that you don't know about. They can blast that out to every vehicle, whether or not you subscribe to any sort of data service in your car. You've got now about 12, 13 states that can basically geofence vehicles and say, whether it's an earthquake, maybe a wildfire is coming in and it's basically destroying the road, they can automatically send these vehicles messages. Again, you're not paying for a data service, you don't even have a cell phone in the car, you'll get a message on your dash basically saying, hey, you need to avoid this area because of a wildfire or road closure or a washout due to a mudslide or something like that. So that's the good news about connected vehicles. The bad news is, this last 2 months or so, GM got caught with a lawsuit filed by the state of Texas, basically claiming that they were infringing users' privacy rights. Followed by that was an FTC investigation and now a class action lawsuit against GM. The allegations was they were taking data from all their vehicles and then selling it to insurance companies. So if you were a hard breaker, you're an unsafe driver, you drove too fast, you cornered too hard, that data was being sold to your insurance company without your knowledge, and your rates were going up and down based on that. This has been very well known in the industry for the last 3 or 4 years. Most consumers I see by many faces around this room are kind of shocked at what I just said, but this is real. Which kind of brings up the question of, okay, these cars collect an enormous amount of data. How do you protect the driver's privacy? What data belongs to the car maker? What data belongs to the individual? Who gets a say in when that data is sent up off the car into the cloud? And this is even more complicated in the world of electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, because of course the autonomous vehicles have orders of magnitude more data being collected than individually driven vehicles. So this problem only gets to be bigger and bigger and bigger, and we're going to see a lot more litigation over the next couple of years with regards to what happens to this data and how is it used. Okay, finally, let's talk about shared vehicles. Shared vehicles, of course, are everything from scooters and bikes to Ubers, Lyfts, and other types of transportation. The promise of shared vehicles is very simple. If you share a vehicle, there's less individually owned vehicles on the road, less constraints in terms of parking, less vehicles on the roadways, and overall much more efficient transportation system. The good news is shared vehicles are already at critical mass. It's the farthest up that S-curve of any of the trends. About 70% of cities, urban areas, have penetration of overall shared vehicles. And again, differs bikes, scooters, Ubers, but you're at about 70% right now between the developed markets. That number goes to over 90% by the end of this decade. So what's driving that? It's a couple things. First of all, urbanization. We've got 4 billion people living in urban cities around the world. Most estimates by the UN put that at over 6 billion over the next 25 years. So you've got a lot more people in urban areas that are struggling with, how do I deal with all these people in my city? How do I move them around from point A to point B? And that's problem number one. Of course, what's the solution for most cities? The solution has been, well, let's go spend hundreds of billions of dollars on mass transit systems. Here in Seattle, many of you are familiar, we've got a big light rail project going on. And right now we're at about what? 150 billion in terms of the expansion cost, which is about a 60% overall cost overrun, and we're about 20 years behind schedule. Does that sound familiar? I don't know what percentage of traffic that's going to remove from the roadways? About 1.5%. 1.5%. So that doesn't solve our problem. So what happens? Fortunately, the free market works. Companies start to step in. They say, hey, I can provide a better service. If people are going short haul, they can use a scooter. Many of you who've been in these urban areas know it's a fun way to get around, albeit a little bit more dangerous, but it's very convenient. E-bikes obviously work in many different areas. Obviously, if you're in Buffalo, New York, or Detroit, Michigan, it's a little different than if you're in Austin, Texas. But that's another option for consumers. And of course, Ubers and Lyfts have been fantastic in terms of getting people to go from point A to point B without having to rent a car or own a car. I've been to San Francisco probably 50 times over the last 5 years, 6 years. I have not rented a car once. Why? Because it's very convenient. You can just summon a vehicle on your phone, the vehicle shows up, takes you from point A to point B. It's a great way for people to get around in terms of transportation. The issue, though, are a couple things. Number one, government pushback. There has been a lot of pushback from governments against the overall AV and the shared vehicle markets. Why is that? Because they compete with the taxi unions, they compete with the medallion system, they compete with other ways the government are receiving revenue, and they feel like this is a problem. So cities like San Francisco, LA, and a variety of others, what have they done? They basically said, well, you need to treat your people like employees, you got to pay them benefits, you need to do this, you need to basically pay them a minimum wage, those type of things. That has the effect of increasing the overall cost of labor. It increases the cost of shared vehicle use, which means people are more likely then to move into buses or other forms of mass transit. So if you talk to cities, and I probably talk to 100 different cities and DOTs any given year, what you find is there's some cities whose goal it is to reduce congestion and get people to move around because that represents economic activity. There's other cities who view it as the goal to shut down the shared systems and increase traffic congestion so that people will move into mass transit and the other government-sponsored systems. So this is a case where you have the free market right now fighting with governments in terms of what the future looks like. The other thing is you have rising cost of these services, not only through the labor laws and things like that, but also because the cost of owning a car, the price of fuel is going up. So as the price of fuel goes up, it gets less economically attractive for the drivers to put their own cars on the road, drive around. If I can't get enough fares, I'm not making enough money, I'm not going to drive my car. So the real problem is the energy costs, which again, many people would argue is a feature, not a bug, but regardless of your view, that's one of the issues that's influencing right now the adoption of shared vehicles. Okay, so where are we? I started out saying the ACES have had a little bit of a choppy road over the last 10 years, but I want you to think about this. I want to put this in perspective for you. The first mass-produced vehicle was the Model T, 1908. That's when Henry Ford started producing them out of the Hamtramck plant in Detroit. It wasn't until 1960s that the majority of Americans had a car. That's 50 years later. It wasn't until the 1980s where you hit saturation here in the United States, where the market and the overall new sales essentially flattened out. So you're talking 50, 60, 70 years for that vehicle, the invention of the vehicle, to basically become a mass market item. This is a little bit different than the curve you saw yesterday from ChatGPT, which is basically reaching hundreds of millions of people in the span of its first month or two after its rollout. Okay, what about airbags? Airbags right now are at about 100% here in the United States. But it took 25 years, long period of time, and the only reason we hit 100% is because it was mandated by the government. If you look at some of the other things like hybrid vehicles, we're at about 4% after 25 years. Navigation systems, 30 years. And right now we're at about 80%. So the question is simply this. I think folks need to appreciate the automotive space does not move quickly. Product cycles are measured in years. It takes 3 to 4 years for the average OEM from when they conceive of a vehicle to when it becomes to roll off the assembly line. So these things take time, and we're 10 years into this cycle. And again, some of these trends, shared vehicles moved very fast. Electric vehicles, same thing. Connected vehicles already approaching saturation, and AVs will soon be sort of in the same position. So I'm going to end with kind of the future, and then we can take a couple questions. I certainly believe that over the next 15, 20 years, the future for autonomous vehicles, connected, electric, shared, this vision that we had of robotaxis being able to do a couple things. You reduce the number of vehicles on the road, which reduces congestion. Electrification reduces pollution. AVs are already safer drivers than human drivers are. If you look at the statistics on a per mile driven basis, we already have improved safety, as well as obviously connected vehicles helping us do a much better job of navigating. I want to close with a quote from Bill Gates. Bill Gates said, I think rather famously, he said, "Innovation tends to take longer in the short term than we would anticipate, but it tends to be much larger in the longer term." And that's exactly what I think we're seeing here with the ACES. The first 10 years have been, in many ways, phenomenally fast for the automotive space. But it's going to be another 10, 20 years until we sort of get the full vision of where I think we end up with the overall autonomous vehicle trend and the others.